The funny thing about being called a failure is that eventually people stop asking how you survived everything they never noticed. I thought about that on the morning we gathered at my father's farmhouse, 6 days after we buried him. My name is Linda Parker. I was 61 years old, widowed, and living about 20 minutes outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, in a 2-bedroom house with a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon before sunrise most mornings. I drove a 12-year-old sedan, bought clothes when I needed them, and operated a small baking business from a licensed kitchen attached to my home. None of that impressed my younger brother David. He arrived at Dad's farm in a polished black sport utility vehicle wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than my first commercial mixer. My older sister Susan arrived 15 minutes later carrying coffee for everyone. We had come to begin sorting Dad's personal belongings and discuss what would happen to the farm. The Parker place covered roughly 160 acres of Iowa farmland, with an old red barn, a machine shed, the farmhouse where all 3 of us had grown up, and fields that had already been harvested for the season. Late October had turned the landscape brown and gold. Corn stubble stretched toward a gray horizon while dry leaves collected against the porch steps. Walking through Dad's front door without hearing his voice still felt wrong. His work boots remained beside the mudroom bench. His reading glasses were folded beside yesterday's world even though his last morning there had already passed. Susan began sorting kitchen drawers because she needed something practical to do. David opened Dad's desk almost immediately. "We should probably talk about the farm before we start dividing personal things," he said. I looked at him. "Today? The sooner the better. There are taxes, insurance, maintenance, probably outstanding operating expenses. Letting everything sit costs money." That sounded like David. He sold commercial real estate in Des Moines and believed most problems became manageable once someone put numbers beside them. "The estate attorney has not even completed the initial review," Susan said. "We can still discuss options." David pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Realistically, selling is probably the cleanest solution." I was standing near the window looking across the north field. "Why?" He seemed surprised that I asked. "Because none of us farms. The acreage is leased. For now." Dad renewed the lease. David looked at me. "When?" "Last spring." "For how long?" "We should review the agreement before discussing that." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You have seen it?" "Yes." "Why?" The question bothered me more than it should have. "Because Dad showed it to me." David leaned back in Dad's chair. "Linda, I am not trying to make this difficult. I just think we need to be realistic. A property like this requires capital and management." "I know. And none of us should feel obligated to keep it because Dad did." "I did not say we should." Susan placed 3 coffee cups on the table. "Maybe we wait until we have all the documents." "That is exactly what I am saying," I replied. David smiled toward Susan as though we were both avoiding an obvious conclusion. "I can get a preliminary valuation. Agricultural investors are still active around here. If we receive a strong offer, there is no reason to carry unnecessary risk." I said nothing. He interpreted my silence the way he always did. David had been doing that for years. To him, my life had never quite added up to success. Susan became a school administrator. David built a career in commercial property. I married Michael, stayed near home, and eventually started baking professionally after he died. When relatives asked what I did, David sometimes described it as the Linda's little baking thing. He had never seen my annual books. He had never asked how many wholesale orders I filled during the holidays. He had certainly never asked why Dad called me every Tuesday morning for nearly 18 years. "You would probably benefit most from selling," David said gently. I turned from the window. "Why me?" "Come on, Linda. I am asking." He shifted in the chair. "You are still working out of your house. You have that old car. You have never had the kind of retirement plan Susan and I have. Your share of The farm could give you some security. Susan looked uncomfortable. David. What? I am trying to be practical. You do not know what my retirement looks like, I said. I know you have worked hard. Nobody is saying otherwise. That sentence was worse than if he had simply admitted what he thought. I walked to Dad's desk and closed the drawer David had left open. Before anyone calls a buyer, we review the lease, the estate documents, the bank records, and every outstanding obligation. David gave a short sigh. Fine. But we cannot let emotion turn this into something complicated. Agreed. He looked surprised by my answer. Good. And that includes your excitement about selling. Susan hid a smile behind her coffee cup. David did not. We spent the next 2 hours sorting Dad's belongings. Near noon, I opened the bottom drawer of the old filing cabinet in his bedroom. Inside were folders labeled by year, exactly as I remembered. Property taxes. Equipment. Crop leases. Insurance. Heartland Community Bank. I ran my fingers across the last folder and felt 18 years collapse into a single moment. I could still see Dad sitting across from Thomas Reed at the bank during one of the hardest seasons the farm had ever faced. David had been in Chicago that week negotiating a property deal. Susan had been dealing with problems at her school. Dad had looked at me and quietly asked whether I thought we could make the numbers work. We had made them work. Nobody else knew how close we had come to failing. I removed my hand from the folder without opening it. From downstairs, I heard David speaking to someone on his phone. 160 acres, he said. Yes, mostly tillable. I think the family will sell if the numbers make sense. I stood completely still. He had already called someone. I carried the bank folder downstairs and placed it on the dining table in front of him. David ended his call. What is that? Something we should review before you promise anyone this farm. He glanced at the label. Dad's bank records. Some of them. Good. That will tell us what debt needs to be cleared. I looked at my brother and realized he genuinely believed he was about to discover why the farm needed to be sold. He had no idea those same records were going to show him who had helped keep it from being sold years ago. David reached for the bank folder, but I placed my hand on top of it before he could open it. These records are not something we should skim between coffee and phone calls, I said. We need the complete file, including anything still held at the bank. He looked at me as though I had suddenly become overly cautious about ordinary paperwork. Linda, I review financial documents every week. Commercial real estate documents. Money is money. Not when operating loans, equipment notes, land leases, and ownership interests are connected. Susan looked from me to David. Linda has a point. David leaned back. Fine. We will get everything. He paused, then added, but if Dad still had significant debt, that makes selling more urgent, not less. I picked up the folder. We do not know that yet. The following Monday, we met with Dad's estate attorney, Rachel Morgan, in her office near downtown Cedar Falls. Rachel had represented Dad for almost 12 years. She was organized, direct, and unwilling to speculate before reviewing documents. She confirmed that the farmhouse, acreage, equipment, and financial accounts were part of an estate structure that would require more than simply dividing everything 3 ways. There are also interests connected to Parker Farm Holdings, she said. David frowned. What holdings? Rachel opened another folder. A limited liability company your father created several years ago to organize certain farm assets and financial interests. I already knew the name. David did not. Why would Dad need a company for one farm? He asked. That is one of the things we are reviewing. His eyes moved toward me. Did you know about this? Yes. How? Dad discussed it with me when it was formed. Why were you involved? I could hear the irritation beneath his question. Because I was helping him with the farm records. David gave a short laugh. You were doing his bookkeeping. Among other things. Rachel looked at me but did not elaborate. She understood confidentiality better than anyone in the room. Susan leaned forward. What does the company change? Potentially quite a bit, Rachel said. We need current banking records, the operating agreement, contribution records, and the agricultural lease before I can give you a complete answer. David checked his watch. I already have someone interested in making an offer. Rachel stopped writing. On what authority? No formal offer. I mentioned the acreage to a contact. Then I recommend you make it clear that no individual beneficiary has authority to sell anything yet. David's expression tightened. I was only gathering information. Gathering information is fine. Representing availability before ownership is clarified is not. I said nothing. Rachel had made the point more effectively than I could have. After the meeting, David followed me into the parking lot. You knew about this company and said nothing Saturday. You did not ask whether Dad had an entity. I should not have to interrogate you for information about our father's estate. And I should not have to interrupt you every time you make an assumption. He stared at me. Susan approached before the conversation could become sharper. Can we please remember why we are here, she said. Dad has been gone less than 2 weeks. David rubbed his forehead. I know. I just want this handled properly. So do I said. Then help me understand why you are acting like selling is a mistake. I have not said selling is a mistake. I said deciding before we understand the finances is a mistake. He looked toward my old sedan parked several spaces away. It was only a glance, but I noticed it. Linda, keeping 160 acres is not like keeping Dad's dining table. There are taxes, insurance, repairs, legal costs, and risk. I do not want you getting attached to something you cannot afford. You keep talking about what I can afford. Because somebody has to. Susan immediately said his name in warning. I felt the familiar temptation to defend myself. I could have told him my house had been paid off for years. I could have explained that my bakery had contracts with 3 local cafes and 2 specialty grocery stores. I could have told him that November and December alone often produce more revenue than he imagined I earned in an entire year. Instead, I asked, when was the last time you looked at my finances? He blinked. That is not the point. It is exactly the point. He opened his mouth, then stopped. I got into my car and drove home. At 5 the next morning, I was in my bakery kitchen shaping 60 dinner rolls for a restaurant order. By 7, 2 pecan pies were cooling beside 12 loaves of sourdough while my assistant, Marlene, packed breakfast pastries for delivery. This was the part of my life David never saw. He visited at Christmas, noticed flour on my counter, and assumed I spent my days making cookies for neighbors. He never saw invoices, payroll, supplier contracts, health inspections, quarterly taxes, or the years it took to turn a folding table at farmers' markets into a reliable business. Around 9, my phone rang. It was Thomas Reed from Heartland Community Bank. Linda, he said warmly, I heard about Robert. I am very sorry. Thank you, Thomas. Your father's attorney contacted us regarding the estate review. There are several accounts and farm documents we need to assemble. I expected that. He paused. It has been a while since all 3 Parker children were involved in the same financial discussion. I smiled despite myself. That is one way to describe it. I imagine David has opinions. Several. Thomas chuckled softly, then became serious. There are records here that your brother and sister may not understand without context. I know. Some of them involve you directly. I looked through the bakery window at the frost still clinging to the grass outside. Rachel mentioned Parker Farm Holdings. Then she has started in the right place. How much should I tell David before the bank meeting? Thomas was quiet for a moment. That is your decision. But you do not owe anyone an explanation before the documents are ready. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. That evening, Susan called. David had obtained a preliminary purchase estimate from an agricultural investment company. The number was high enough to make her nervous. He thinks we should move quickly if they make a formal offer, she said. What do you think? I think we still do not know what we are selling. Linda, is there something you are not telling us? I looked at the old farm ledger Dad had given me years earlier, now resting inside my desk drawer. There are things David has never asked about. Susan was silent. That is not the same answer. No, I said. It is not. The next morning, an email from David arrived with the preliminary valuation attached. At the bottom he had written one sentence: this could finally give all three of us some real financial security. I read it twice. Then I opened the folder containing 17 years of cancelled checks, loan records, tax receipts, and capital contribution statements bearing my name. David believed the farm was about to give me financial security. He still had no idea how many years I had spent giving financial security to the farm. The preliminary offer arrived 2 days later, and David treated the number as though the decision had already been made. The investment company valued the farm at just over $2 million, subject to inspection, title review, and confirmation of the current lease. David forwarded the proposal to Susan and me before 7 in the morning with a message saying we would be foolish not to consider it seriously. I was already in the bakery, glazing apple turnovers while Marlene prepared a wholesale order, so I waited until the ovens were loaded before reading the entire document. The price was attractive, but the offer included conditions that immediately bothered me. The buyer wanted possession after the current crop year, flexibility to renegotiate the tenant arrangement, and access to begin soil and drainage evaluations before closing. More importantly, the proposal assumed that all 160 acres could be transferred as a single unrestricted parcel. I knew that assumption had not been verified. Dad had changed several things during the last decade, including how certain farm assets were held and how capital contributions were recorded. I called Rachel Morgan instead of David. Have you seen the offer? I asked. David sent it this morning. Does the buyer know about Parker Farm Holdings? Not according to what I received. Then they are valuing something before confirming who owns what. That is my concern too. Rachel told me not to sign anything and reminded me that no sale could proceed until the estate and company records were reconciled. Less than an hour later, David called. Pretty good number, is it not? It is a preliminary number. It is more than preliminary. They are serious. They have not reviewed the ownership structure. That is what attorneys handle after everyone agrees on basic terms. Not when the basic terms assume facts that have not been established. He sighed. Linda, buyers do not wait forever. Neither do mistakes disappear because someone made them quickly. There was a pause. You are making this emotional. I am reading the document. I read it too. Then you saw the section about possession after the crop year. Yes. And the provision allowing pre-closing access. Standard due diligence. And the assumption that the acreage can be conveyed without restrictions from any related entity. Another pause. Rachel can clean that up. Rachel cannot clean up ownership by pretending it is simpler than it is. David's voice changed. What exactly do you know that I do not? Enough to know we should wait for the bank records. There it is again. Wait. Review. Slow down. You have always done this. Done what? Avoided decisions until somebody else had to make them. I stood beside the stainless steel counter with a tray of pastries cooling in front of me. For a moment, I forgot about the offer. Is that what you think I have done with my life? I am talking about the farm. No, you are not. He exhaled. I have meetings all morning. We can discuss this Sunday when Susan comes over. He ended the call before I answered. Sunday afternoon, the three of us met at Dad's farmhouse again. David had printed the offer and marked sections with colored tabs. Susan sat at the dining table while I made coffee in the same old percolator Dad had used for years. "I spoke with Rachel," Susan said. "She thinks we need more information." David nodded impatiently. "Of course. Attorneys want more information. That is how attorneys work." I carried the coffee to the table. "That is also how responsible owners work." David tapped the offer. "Responsible owners recognize opportunity. Responsible owners understand what they own first." Susan looked at me. "Can you explain Parker Farm Holdings?" "Not completely until Rachel confirms the current records." "But you know something." "I know Dad created it after we restructured part of the farm finances." David stared at me. "We?" The room became very quiet. I had not intended to use that word, but there was no reason to take it back. "Dad and I." "You helped restructure his finances?" "Yes." "When?" "More than once." David leaned back. "Since when are you a farm finance expert?" "I never said I was an expert." "Then why was Dad discussing loans with you instead of calling me?" "Because I was here." His expression hardened. "That is not an answer." "It is the answer." I remembered a February morning nearly 18 years earlier when Dad had sat at my kitchen table with unpaid invoices spread between us. Fertilizer costs had climbed, machinery repairs had been worse than expected, and a poor season had left him short on operating cash. He had been too proud to tell David. He had not wanted Susan worrying. I had driven him to Heartland Community Bank and sat beside him while Thomas Reed explained the refinancing options. Later, when Dad needed money to cover property taxes before a lease payment arrived, I wrote a check from savings Michael and I had accumulated before his death. It was not heroic. It was simply necessary. David pointed toward the offer. "Whatever happened years ago does not change what makes sense today." "Maybe not. But it changes whether this proposal is even structured correctly. You are willing to risk a $2 million offer because you think Dad told you things nobody else knew." "No. I am willing to wait 5 days for verified records before making an irreversible decision." Susan nodded slowly. 5 days is reasonable." David looked at her. "You are siding with her now." "I am siding with knowing what we are doing." He stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the harvested field stretched toward the county road under a pale November sky. "I am trying to protect all of us," he said. Then he turned toward me. "Especially you. You may think that bakery gives you independence, but maintaining property like this is different. You should not gamble your future trying to prove something." I felt something inside me settle rather than break. "I am not trying to prove anything, David." "Then let us sell." "Not yet." He shook his head. "You have no idea what kind of financial responsibility you are talking about." I looked at the folder beside my chair containing copies of tax payments, refinancing documents, and capital contributions that had helped carry that responsibility for years. "Then I suppose," I said quietly, "we should let the records decide which one of us understands it." The meeting at Heartland Community Bank was scheduled for Thursday morning. David believed Thomas Reed was finally going to explain to me why keeping the farm was unrealistic. I knew Thomas would not take anyone's side. He would do something much more uncomfortable. He would open the files. By Wednesday evening, David had already decided what Thursday's bank meeting was supposed to accomplish. He called Susan and me to say he wanted everyone focused on one question: whether keeping the farm made financial sense. I almost laughed at the wording. Not because the question was unreasonable, but because David still believed he was the only person asking it. That evening, Susan came to my house for dinner. I had finished the bakery orders by 4, and the kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon, butter, and coffee. She sat at my table while I reheated vegetable soup and sliced a loaf of bread from that morning's batch. "David is frustrated," she said. "I noticed. He thinks you are resisting the sale because you are afraid of losing Dad's place." "Do you think that?" Susan looked down at her soup. I think this has been harder on you than either of us. That was not my question. She remained silent long enough to answer it anyway. I do not know, she finally said. You have always been more sentimental about home. I folded the dish towel beside the sink. Being careful is not the same as being sentimental. I know. Do you? She looked at me with genuine surprise. I had rarely challenged Susan directly. She was not dismissive like David, but for years she had accepted his version of me without questioning it. Linda stayed close to home. Linda baked. Linda lived simply. Linda probably needed help. You both talk about me as though my life stopped developing because I never moved away, I said. That is not fair. Is it not? Susan sighed. I have never thought you were incapable. But you think David understands money better than I do. He works in real estate. And I have operated a business for 14 years. I know. Do you know what my annual revenue was last year? She hesitated. No. Do you know whether I have a mortgage? No. Do you know what I have saved for retirement? No. Then what exactly do you know about whether I need the farm sold for financial security? Susan lowered her spoon. Nothing, apparently. There was no anger in her voice, only discomfort. I regretted the sharpness of my questions, but not the questions themselves. I am not asking you to believe I am wealthy, I said. I am asking you to stop assuming modest means helpless. She nodded slowly. That is fair. The next afternoon, David asked us to meet at Dad's farmhouse before the bank appointment. He had brought sandwiches and another folder of documents. We sat around the dining table where our mother had served Sunday dinners for more than 30 years. David placed the purchase proposal between us. I spoke with the investor again, he said. They may improve the offer if we indicate serious interest this week. You called them again? I asked. I told them the estate is still reviewing everything. That is not the same as serious interest. His jaw tightened. Why are you determined to make every step difficult? Because you keep taking steps before we agree to take them. Susan raised a hand. Can we not do this again? David looked toward her. I am trying to preserve a strong offer. And Linda is asking us to wait until tomorrow, Susan said. He stared at her. You changed your mind. I asked myself what I actually know about the farm's finances. The answer is not enough. David leaned back and looked at me. So now you are the financial authority. Nobody said that. You do not have to. This entire week has become everyone waiting for Linda to reveal some mysterious piece of information. I remained quiet. He continued. I have spent 30 years negotiating property transactions. I know what land costs. I know what holding property costs. I know what happens when families keep assets because they cannot separate emotion from economics. And I know this farm. Because you lived nearby. Because Dad involved me. You keep saying that as though it makes you qualified. I felt Susan watching us. Qualified for what? To decide whether we should turn down more than $2 million. I have not turned anything down. You are delaying. For less than 1 week. David shook his head. This is what worries me. You have never had to make decisions at this scale. Your bakery is fine, Linda. I am glad it works for you. But selling pies and bread is not the same as managing millions of dollars in assets. The words landed harder because he said them calmly. My bakery is fine. I asked. Do not twist what I said. I am trying to understand what you said. He rubbed his forehead. Look, Susan had a real career. I built a real career. You made different choices. There is nothing wrong with that. Different choices. Yes. You mean smaller ones. I did not say that. You did not need to. He looked frustrated now. You have spent years barely changing anything. Same house. Same car. Same little business. Now suddenly you want everyone to believe you understand complex farm financing better than people who actually deal with large transactions. Susan said, "David, stop." But he did not. Some of us had careers, Linda. Some of us built financial security. You survived. There is no shame in that, but please do not confuse surviving with being prepared to manage something this large. The room went completely still. I looked at the man who had once been the little boy following me through corn rows, asking me to help tie his shoes because he could never make the loop stay even. I did not feel angry. I felt tired. "Is that really how you see me?" I asked. David's expression changed slightly, but pride kept him from taking the words back. "I am saying I do not want emotion costing you your best chance at security." Susan stared down at the table. Her silence hurt almost as much as David's words. I gathered the papers I had brought. "Then tomorrow should be useful." "What does that mean?" David asked. "You want the bank manager to explain the financial reality." I agree. He studied my face, perhaps expecting sarcasm. "So you will listen if Thomas says selling is the responsible choice?" "I will listen to everything Thomas says." I stood and put on my coat. Susan followed me to the porch. "Linda, wait." "I am fine." He should not have said that. I looked across Dad's dark fields. "But he believes it." She had no answer. The next morning, I arrived at Heartland Community Bank 10 minutes early. Thomas Reed was standing near the lobby when I entered. His silver hair had grown thinner since our last meeting, but his calm expression had not changed. He walked toward me and extended both hands. "Linda, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I." He glanced at the thick folder I was carrying. "You brought your copies?" 17 years of them. Thomas smiled faintly. "I suspected you would." A few minutes later, David entered with Susan behind him. David saw Thomas greeting me and slowed for just a moment. Thomas turned toward him. "David Parker. It has been a long time." They shook hands. "Too long," David said. "Thank you for meeting with us. I think Linda needs some clarity about what keeping the farm would actually involve." Thomas looked at David, then at me. His expression remained polite, but something changed in his eyes. "Yes," he said. "I think clarity is exactly what this family needs." Thomas led us into a conference room at the back of the bank, the same room where Dad and I had sat through more difficult conversations than David could imagine. The furniture had changed, but the view had not. Through the wide windows, I could still see the courthouse clock above the buildings across downtown Cedar Falls. Thomas placed 3 thick folders on the table and waited until we were seated. David immediately set the investor proposal beside them. "I appreciate you gathering everything," he said. "What we really need to understand is how much debt remains against the farm and whether keeping it makes economic sense." Thomas adjusted his glasses. "We can review the obligations that the estate attorney has authorized us to discuss. Rachel Morgan sent the necessary documentation yesterday." David nodded. "Perfect. My concern is that Linda may be underestimating the carrying costs." Thomas looked briefly at me, then opened the first folder. "Before we discuss carrying costs, we need to separate Robert Parker's personal estate from Parker Farm Holdings. They are related, but they are not identical." David leaned forward. "How much of the acreage belongs to the company?" "Most of the agricultural operation is connected to it through the structure Robert established." "And Dad owned the company." Thomas paused. "Robert held an interest." David frowned. "An interest? Who owns the rest?" Thomas turned several pages. "That will be addressed through the operating agreement and contribution records. Rachel will provide the legal interpretation. I can explain the banking history." Susan glanced at me. David did too. "All right," he said. "Then let us start with the debt." Thomas explained that the farm still carried a modest balance associated with improvements completed several years earlier, including drainage work and repairs to the machine shed. The amount was nowhere near what David had apparently expected. The current agricultural lease generated enough annual income to cover taxes, insurance, routine maintenance, and scheduled loan payments with room remaining. David looked surprised. So Dad was cash flow positive on the lease? For the last several years, yes. Why did nobody tell me? Thomas folded his hands. That would have been Robert's decision. David looked toward me. You knew? Yes. Of course you did. His tone made Susan shift in her chair. Thomas continued. The current tenant has a strong payment history, and the lease was renewed in March. Linda mentioned that, David said. She seems to have been involved in quite a lot. She was. Thomas said it so naturally that David stopped moving. What exactly does that mean? He asked. Thomas looked at me. Linda, are you comfortable with me discussing your involvement where it intersects with the authorized farm records? Yes. David glanced between us. Why would you need her permission? Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the second folder. Because some of these records concern Linda directly. The room became very quiet. He removed several statements and arranged them carefully on the table. Robert began experiencing significant operating pressure nearly 18 years ago. 2 difficult crop years, equipment repairs, increased input costs, and existing obligations created a liquidity problem. David nodded. I remember Dad saying farming was difficult around then. He understated how difficult. Thomas turned another page. There was a period when selling part of the acreage was seriously considered. Susan looked startled. Dad never told us that. He did not want to worry you, I said. David looked at me. But he told you. Eventually. Thomas continued. Robert came into this bank with Linda. She had already helped organize his outstanding bills, lease income, tax obligations, and equipment expenses. We worked through several refinancing options. David gave a small, skeptical smile. Linda helped organize paperwork. Fine. I am not questioning that. Thomas looked directly at him. That is not what I said. David's smile disappeared. Thomas remained calm. Your sister participated in the financial planning. She attended meetings, reviewed cash flow projections, questioned loan terms, and helped Robert determine which equipment could be retained and which expenses needed to be reduced. David leaned back. She is a baker. I felt Susan turn toward him. Thomas did not. She owns a business, he said. There is a difference between those statements. David crossed his arms. I am not insulting her business. I am saying farm finance is different. It is, Thomas replied. Which is why Linda spent years learning it. Nobody spoke. Thomas opened another section of the file. When refinancing a loan was insufficient, Robert needed additional liquidity. Linda provided some of it. David stared at him. Provided it how? Documented loans. From where? From her own funds. David looked at me as though Thomas had switched to another language. How much? Thomas glanced at me again. I nodded. The first contribution was $28,000, he said. There were additional advances later. Susan's hand moved toward her mouth. David shook his head. That does not make sense. Linda and Michael were not wealthy. We were not, I said. We saved. Thomas continued before David could respond. After Michael passed away, Linda continued helping Robert when necessary. During 2 years when timing between expenses and lease income became difficult, she covered property taxes temporarily. She also participated in restructuring the remaining operating obligations. David looked down at the table. Why would Dad accept that? He resisted it, I said. For months. And you just kept giving him money? No. Everything was documented. Thomas tapped the folder gently. Robert insisted on that. He did not want informal family arrangements. Over time, some obligations were repaid. Others were converted into capital contributions when Parker Farm Holdings was established. David slowly raised his head. Capital contributions? Yes. Meaning ownership. Thomas nodded once. Meaning Linda has a documented financial interest in the entity. For the first time since Dad died, David had nothing to say. Susan looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Shock was part of it. So was embarrassment. David finally cleared his throat. How large an interest? Rachel will review the final percentages with you because estate transfers affect the current calculation, Thomas said. But it is substantial enough that no serious discussion about the farm's future should have been taking place without Linda. David's face reddened slightly. Nobody was excluding her. Thomas closed the folder. You came into this meeting saying Linda needed clarity about the financial responsibility of keeping the farm. His voice remained courteous. I think the record requires me to correct that impression. David stared at him. Thomas continued. Your sister was sitting in this office helping your father solve problems long before you knew those problems existed. Susan looked down. I kept my hands folded in my lap. There was no satisfaction in watching David absorb the words. Only relief that, for once, I did not have to defend my own history. David glanced toward the investor proposal he had brought so confidently. Then why did nobody tell me any of this? Thomas answered before I could. Perhaps because Linda was helping your father, not building a case for herself. David looked at me. I held his gaze. The room was silent for several seconds before Thomas opened the third folder. And before anyone decides whether this farm should be sold, he said, there is another set of records you need to understand. These show exactly what Linda contributed, what Robert repaid, and why he structured Parker Farm Holdings the way he did. David slowly pulled the investor proposal away from the center of the table. For the first time since he had arrived, he was no longer trying to lead the meeting. Thomas opened the third folder and turned it so all three of us could see the first page. It was a contribution ledger created when Parker Farm Holdings had been organized, with entries going back through years of loans, repayments, tax advances, and converted equity. David stared at the numbers without speaking. Thomas moved slowly through the records, explaining that Dad had repaid several of my early loans after stronger harvest years, but not all of them. When Parker Farm Holdings was created, Dad had insisted that the remaining balance be formally recognized rather than forgotten as something one family member had simply done for another. Robert was very specific about this, Thomas said. He believed Linda had assumed financial risk when the farm needed it, and he did not believe family relationship erased that obligation. Susan looked at me. You never told us any of this. There was nothing for you to do about it. You could have asked us to help. Maybe I should have. I paused. But Dad did not want everyone rearranging their lives because he had a difficult season. David finally spoke. How much did she contribute altogether? Thomas reviewed the ledger before answering. If you count direct loans, temporary tax advances, and capital later placed into the company, the cumulative amount over the years was significant. But the total alone is misleading because some funds were repaid and some became equity. What is the current equity? David asked. Rachel will confirm the exact percentage after the estate interests are processed. What matters today is that Linda is not simply an heir waiting for 1/3 of whatever remains. She already holds a legitimate interest created through documented contributions. David rubbed his jaw. I still do not understand where the money came from. I knew what he meant. He was looking at the woman with the old sedan and the small house and trying to fit her into numbers he had never imagined. Michael and I saved, I said. After he died, I kept saving. The bakery grew. I did not spend much. But $28,000 on the first loan alone. I had it. And you gave it to Dad. I loaned it to Dad. David looked almost offended by the distinction, as though financial discipline belonged to a world he had assumed I never entered. Thomas closed one statement and opened another. Linda also maintained separate reserves. Robert never accepted funds that would leave her unable to meet her own obligations. Susan looked at me carefully. Is your house paid off? I nodded. For 9 years. David's eyes widened. Why are you still driving that car? I almost smiled. Because it starts every morning. Susan gave a quiet laugh, but David did not. He was still recalculating my entire life. Thomas continued through the farm records. The current loan balance was manageable. The tenant's lease generated dependable annual income. Property taxes were current. Insurance was current. The drainage improvements had increased productivity in several sections of the acreage. There was no emergency forcing a sale. That does not mean selling is wrong, Thomas said. It means selling should be evaluated as a choice, not treated as a rescue. The word rescue hung in the room. David had spent 2 weeks talking as though he were rescuing me. I watched him glance at the investment proposal lying near his elbow. So if we do nothing immediately, Susan asked, the farm can support itself. Under the present lease and current obligations, yes, Thomas replied. Assuming normal expenses and no major unforeseen event. And Dad knew that. Robert worked very hard to reach that position. Thomas looked toward me. He was not alone. David pushed his chair back slightly. I wish someone had told me. This time I answered. When? He looked at me. Anytime during the last 18 years. You were busy. I would have made time. Dad did not want to ask you. But he asked you. No. Not at first. I remembered the night Dad had shown up at my house carrying a grocery bag filled with unopened bills because he was embarrassed to bring them in a folder. He had not asked for money. He had asked whether I could help him understand how far behind he really was. I found out because I noticed, I said. His tractor repair bill sat unopened for 3 weeks. He stopped ordering the seed he normally used. He started skipping Sunday breakfast because he said restaurant prices were getting ridiculous. None of those things meant much separately. Together, they told me something was wrong. Susan's face changed. I remember him complaining about breakfast prices. So do I, David said quietly. I thought he was just being Dad. So did everyone. Thomas gave us a moment before continuing. There is another reason Robert established the company structure. He wanted the farm managed according to contribution and responsibility rather than assumptions. David looked at him. What assumptions? Thomas chose his words carefully. Robert worried that after his death, the 3 of you might look at the land only as an inheritance. He wanted the financial history preserved so whoever handled it would understand what it had taken to keep it intact. Susan lowered her eyes. David asked, did he leave instructions? Rachel has documents relating to that. The bank does not interpret estate intentions beyond the records we administer. Thomas gathered the statements into a neat stack. But I can tell you something Robert said in this room more than once. He was proud that the farm eventually became stable again. And he credited Linda with helping him get there. My throat tightened. I looked toward the window because I did not want either of my siblings watching my face. Dad rarely praised anyone directly. His version of gratitude had usually been leaving a basket of tomatoes on my porch or arriving at the bakery with a broken shelf he had decided to repair without being asked. David sat silently for several seconds. Then he looked at me. Yesterday I told you that you had spent your life surviving. I said nothing. I did not know any of this. No, I said. You did not. Why did you let me say those things? The question surprised me. What was I supposed to do? Hand you my bank statements until you respected me? Susan closed her eyes briefly. David looked down. That is not what I meant. Maybe not. But that is what it would have taken, because every time I told you I understood the farm, you looked at my car, my house, and my bakery and decided you knew better. Thomas remained silent. This was no longer a banking discussion. David slowly folded the investor proposal and placed it inside his briefcase. I am not calling them again, he said. Not until we know everything. It was the first decision he had made since Dad's death that sounded like something we had decided together. As we stood to leave, Thomas handed Rachel's requested copies to me rather than David. David noticed. Outside, the November wind moved across the parking lot, carrying the first hint of winter. Susan walked beside me toward my car. David remained several steps behind. My phone rang before I reached the driver's door. It was Rachel Morgan. Linda, she said, I finished reviewing the materials your father left with my office. There is a handwritten ledger and a sealed letter that he specifically instructed me to read with all three of you present. I looked back at David and Susan. When? Tomorrow afternoon. Does it concern the farm? Rachel paused. It concerns the farm, but I think it concerns the three of you even more. The next afternoon, the three of us sat across from Rachel Morgan in her office while the November sky darkened beyond the windows. David had arrived first, but for once there was no investor proposal on the table, no legal pad filled with numbers, and no speech about what we should do next. Rachel placed Dad's handwritten ledger between us, then set a cream-colored envelope beside it. My name was not written on the envelope. Neither were David's or Susan's. Across the front, in Dad's uneven handwriting, were the words for my children. Rachel opened the ledger first. Unlike the bank records, these pages were personal. Dad had recorded dates, amounts, reasons, repayments, and short notes beside nearly every financial decision involving the farm. There was the first $28,000 loan I had made when the operating account was running dangerously low. There were 2 property tax advances. There was money I had contributed toward drainage work after heavy spring rains damaged several sections of the north field. There were also repayments Dad had made to me whenever the farm produced enough surplus. David followed every entry with his eyes. He kept all of this himself, he asked. Apparently, Rachel said. I recognized the notebook. Dad used to keep it inside the bottom drawer of his desk, although I had never known what he wrote in it. Rachel turned several pages. Beside one entry, Dad had written that I refused interest on a short-term advance, so he calculated it anyway and added it to the amount later converted into my ownership interest. I smiled despite the ache in my chest. That sounded exactly like him. Susan leaned toward me. How many times did you help? I stopped counting it that way. Why? Because some years he needed help and some years he did not. David looked at the ledger. This went on for more than a decade. Yes. And you never asked either of us for anything. Dad did not want me to. David shook his head slowly. I keep thinking about all those phone calls when I asked him how the farm was doing. He always said, everything was fine. By the time you called, sometimes it was. David looked at me, and this time there was no defensiveness in his expression. Only regret. Rachel reached for the envelope. Robert gave this to me when he updated his estate documents 4 years ago. He instructed me to keep it unless the three of you had to make a major decision concerning the farm together. Susan whispered, that sounds like Dad. Rachel opened the envelope and unfolded 2 sheets of paper. She explained that the letter did not replace the legal documents. It was simply something Dad wanted us to hear. Then she began reading. Dad wrote about the farm first. He said land had a way of making people confuse value with price. A buyer could tell you what an acre was worth that year, but a family had to decide what responsibility was worth. He did not demand that we keep the farm forever, In fact, he specifically said we should sell someday if selling became the wisest choice. What mattered to him was that we make the decision with complete information and without assuming the loudest person understood the most. David lowered his eyes. Rachel continued. Dad wrote about each of us. He was proud of Susan for spending decades in education and for building a stable home while carrying responsibilities he admitted he never fully understood. He was proud of David for leaving Iowa, taking risks, and building a career from nothing more than ambition and stubbornness. Then Rachel reached the section about me. I had prepared myself for numbers. Dad did not write about numbers. He wrote that I was the child who noticed things. I noticed when Mom became tired before she admitted she needed help. I noticed when the barn roof began leaking before the damage became expensive. I noticed when his bills stopped being ordinary bills and became something he was afraid to open. Rachel paused, and I stared at the grain of the conference table because looking at anyone else had become impossible. Dad wrote that I never made him feel ashamed for needing help. He said I had sat beside him at the bank when he felt like a failed farmer and treated the meeting as a problem to solve rather than a judgment on his life. Then came the sentence that made Susan reach across the table and take my hand. Dad wrote that if anyone ever looked at my small house, old car, or bakery and concluded that I had accomplished less than my brother or sister, they were measuring the wrong things. David closed his eyes. Rachel continued reading. Dad said he knew all three of us had different ideas about success. He warned us not to turn those differences into rankings. David understood opportunity. Susan understood people. I understood stewardship. The farm had survived because, at different times, it needed all three qualities, even if only one of us had been present during its hardest financial years. When Rachel finished, nobody spoke. The office was so quiet I could hear the heating system come on. David finally looked at me. I called you a failure. I swallowed. You did. After Dad sat in this same town feeling like one himself, and you were the person who helped him through it. You did not know. I did not ask. That distinction mattered. Susan squeezed my hand. Neither did I. David leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I kept looking at what you did not have. Bigger house. New car. Corporate title. I never asked what you had chosen instead. I liked my life, David. I know that now. I like being near Dad. I like my bakery. I like knowing what I owe and what I own. None of those things happened because I could not do something else. He nodded. I understand. Not completely, I said. But maybe you will. He accepted that without arguing. Rachel then reviewed the updated ownership structure. Once Dad's estate interest was distributed according to his documents, all three of us would hold meaningful stakes, but my existing capital interest remained separate and fully recognized. No one could simply treat the farm as an untouched inheritance divided from zero. David listened carefully, asking questions instead of making declarations. When the meeting ended, he stood beside me in the hallway. I owe you more than an apology. Start with the apology. He almost smiled. I am sorry, Linda. Not because Thomas corrected me or because Dad left records. I am sorry. Because I decided what your life was worth without ever asking how you built it. For the first time in weeks, I felt the anger I had been holding loosen. That is a better place to start. Outside, light snow had begun falling over Cedar Falls, barely enough to remain on the sidewalks. Susan walked ahead toward her car while David stayed beside me. What do you think we should do about the offer? He asked. It was such a simple question that he probably did not understand why I stopped walking. For the first time since Dad died, David was not telling me what the responsible decision was. He was asking what I thought. I think we should find out whether keeping the farm still makes sense for all three of us, I said. And if it does? Then we keep it until it does not. David nodded. All right. But before we could make that decision, there was one place he needed to see, because the farm was not the only part of my life he had misunderstood. The following Monday, just before sunrise, David pulled into my driveway while every light in my bakery kitchen was already burning. David arrived at 5:45 carrying 2 coffees and wearing shoes that had clearly never seen a bakery floor. I was already halfway through the morning production schedule. 3 racks of dinner rolls were proofing near the ovens, pecan pies were cooling along the stainless steel counter, and Marlene was packing cinnamon bread for delivery to 2 cafes. David stood just inside the kitchen doorway and looked around as though he had entered the wrong building. "I thought you worked out of your kitchen," he said. "I do." I pointed toward the commercial workspace attached to the back of my house. "This is my kitchen." He stared at the convection ovens, stainless steel sinks, ingredient storage, refrigeration units, and rows of labeled orders. "When did all this happen?" "Slowly." Marlene handed me a clipboard. I checked the morning delivery list, signed 2 invoices, and adjusted an order after one restaurant requested another 4 dozen rolls for a holiday event. David watched without saying much. That alone was unusual. Around 7, our delivery driver arrived. By 7:30, the first wholesale orders were gone and the next batch was in the ovens. David finally sat at the small desk near the storage room. "How many people work for you?" 2 regular employees besides me, plus seasonal help in November and December. "And the cafes?" 3 cafes, 2 specialty grocery stores, several restaurants during the holidays, and direct customer orders. He looked toward the shelves. "I thought you sold pies to people around town." "I do that too." He rubbed his hands together around the coffee cup. "I really did not know anything about this." "No. You could have corrected me." I smiled slightly. "Every Thanksgiving, you came here, ate pie, and left before sunrise the next morning. You never asked why I was exhausted." He lowered his eyes. "Fair." I finished checking the next production sheet before sitting across from him. This business did not become profitable overnight. For the first 3 years, I barely paid myself. Michael helped me build the original work tables. After he died, I nearly closed it because running everything alone felt impossible. "Why did you not tell us? You had your life. Susan had hers. And I was not looking for permission to keep going." David looked through the interior window at Marlene arranging loaves on cooling racks. "Dad knew all this. Dad helped install those shelves. He delivered orders when my car was being repaired. He also complained that I charged too little for apple pie." David laughed softly. "That sounds like him." For a few seconds, we were simply brother and sister again. Then his expression became serious. "I have been thinking about what he wrote." "So have I. Especially the part about measuring people." He stared into his coffee. "I think I have done that for years without realizing it. I walk into a building and notice what it is worth. I meet someone and notice their job, their house, what they drive. I suppose I started doing the same thing with family." "Probably. You are not going to make this easy for me, are you? You spent years making it easy for yourself." He nodded. "I deserved that." I shook my head. "This is not about what you deserve. That is exactly what I do not want. I do not want you embarrassed because Thomas corrected you. I want you to understand why you were wrong. I think I am beginning to." Later that morning, Susan joined us. We moved into my dining room with copies of the farm lease, operating expenses, insurance records, and Rachel's ownership summary. This time David did not sit at the head of the table. He placed his calculator in the middle where all 3 of us could use it. We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing the farm as an operating asset instead of an inheritance waiting to be divided. The numbers were straightforward once nobody was trying to force them toward a predetermined conclusion. The tenant farmer had several years remaining on a favorable lease. After taxes, insurance, maintenance reserves, and loan payments, the farm still produced positive annual income. Selling would give us immediate liquidity, but keeping the acreage did not threaten anyone financially. David used his real estate experience to identify several provisions in the lease that could be improved when renewal came. Susan noticed gaps in how Dad had organized older records and volunteered to digitize them. I reviewed the operating expenses and reserve requirements. For the first time since Dad died, none of us was competing to prove who understood the most. There is another option, David said. We reject the current offer, keep the farm intact, and revisit the question after the existing lease gets closer to renewal. By then we will have better income history and no pressure from the estate process. I looked at Susan. That makes sense to me. She nodded. Me too. David hesitated before asking, Linda. The fact that he waited mattered more than he knew. I agree. He wrote the decision on his legal pad. No argument. No lecture. Just agreement. That afternoon, we called Rachel together. She confirmed that the structure was legally workable. Over the next 2 weeks, we completed the necessary estate transfers, maintained Parker Farm Holdings, and established a separate reserve account for future repairs and taxes. David withdrew the property from informal discussions with the agricultural investor. The buyer was disappointed but professional. Nothing dramatic happened. No fortune appeared overnight. No one lost everything. We simply made a better decision because we finally understood what we were deciding. A few days before Thanksgiving, Susan returned to help me package holiday orders. She lasted 40 minutes before admitting that folding bakery boxes was harder than it looked. David arrived later carrying lunch. He walked through the kitchen, looked at more than 100 labeled orders waiting for pickup, and shook his head. Little baking thing, he said quietly. I really said that, did I not? More than once. I am never going to hear the end of this. Probably not. He smiled, then handed me a folder. Inside was a draft management plan for the farm. He had listed all 3 of us equally at the top. Under responsibilities, he had assigned himself lease negotiations and market analysis, Susan record organization and family communications, and me financial oversight and banking. I thought you should review it before we send anything to Rachel, he said. I looked at him. You are asking me. I am learning. I read the first page while he waited. There were things I wanted changed, and for once I did not soften my opinion to keep the peace. David listened, took notes, and revised the document. By early December, the first real snow covered Dad's fields. The farm was still ours, the tenant was still working it, and the account Thomas had helped us establish held enough reserves to handle the coming year's expected expenses. Yet one unfinished piece remained. Dad's property had survived the argument, but the 3 of us still had to decide what kind of family would remain after it. That answer came on a cold Saturday morning when David called and asked Susan and me to meet him at the old red barn. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving a thin white layer across the fields and along the roof of Dad's red barn. When I pulled into the gravel drive, David was already there. His expensive black sport utility vehicle looked strangely out of place beside Dad's old machine shed, but David himself did not. He was wearing work boots, jeans, and a heavy brown coat I remembered from years earlier. Susan arrived a few minutes after me carrying 3 cups of coffee. Why are we standing outside when it is 26 degrees? She asked. David smiled. Because I wanted you to see something. He opened the barn door and led us inside. The familiar smell of old wood, machinery oil, and stored hay brought back more memories than I expected. Dad's workbench remained against the far wall. Above it hung the wooden measuring stick he had used since we were children. David placed a folder on the bench. Rachel finished the management documents yesterday. I opened it. The revised agreement reflected everything we had discussed. Parker Farm Holdings would remain intact. The existing tenant lease would continue. We had established reserves for taxes, insurance, repairs, and future improvements. David would handle market analysis and lease negotiations. Susan would maintain records and coordinate family decisions. I would oversee banking, budgets, and operating reserves. Major decisions required all three of us. Nobody controlled the farm alone. There is one change from the draft you saw, David said. I looked down the page. Which one? The section on financial oversight. I found it. Instead of describing my role as temporary until the estate settled, the revised agreement made it ongoing. You changed this. I did. Why? David leaned against Dad's workbench. Because I finally understood something. I kept treating your experience like it only mattered because Dad trusted you. That still made it sound like he had given you authority as a favor. He shook his head. You earned your place in these decisions long before he died. Susan nodded. I agree. I looked at both of them. A month earlier, I might have expected that moment to feel triumphant. It did not. It felt quieter than that. I do not need to run the farm, I said. We know, Susan replied. That is why we trust you to help manage it. David handed me a pen. Nothing gets finalized until you approve the changes. I read every page. There were 2 provisions I wanted clarified and 1 reserve percentage I thought should be slightly higher. David listened without interrupting. He made notes in the margin. When I finished, he asked the question that had become unexpectedly important to me. What do you think? I think Dad would complain about the attorney fees. Susan laughed. David did too. After that, he said. I closed the folder. I think it works. We walked outside and stood beside the barn. Beyond us, 160 acres stretched beneath the pale winter sky. The fields were dormant now, but I could already imagine green returning in spring. Dad had never believed land was valuable simply because someone offered money for it. He believed value came from what something could continue producing when it was cared for properly. I realized families were not very different. Susan handed me my coffee. Do you remember when Dad made us clear snow from this driveway before Christmas? Every year, I said. David smiled. I remember Linda always finishing my side because I complained that my hands were cold. You were 8. I was delicate. Susan laughed again. For the first time since Dad died, remembering him did not feel entirely like losing him. Later that afternoon, David followed me home. I assumed he wanted another copy of the farm documents, but instead he walked into the bakery carrying a cardboard box. What is that? I asked. Something Dad had in the machine shed. Inside was an old wooden sign. Michael had made it for me during the first year I sold baked goods at farmers' markets. The painted letters had faded badly, but I recognized it immediately. Parker Home Baking. Dad kept this? I asked. Apparently. David ran his hand across the worn edge. I remember seeing you behind a folding table with 6 pies and maybe 10 loaves of bread. That sounds about right. He looked through the interior window toward the commercial ovens where Marlene was preparing an afternoon order. And I thought you never went anywhere. I did not go very far. That is not what I mean. He looked at the old sign again. You built all this from that table. 1 order at a time. And you paid off your house. Eventually. Built retirement savings. Yes. Helped Dad save the farm. Helped him stabilize it. David smiled slightly. You still correct every exaggeration. Somebody has to. He became serious. I used to think success meant getting farther away from where you started. Bigger deals, bigger buildings, bigger numbers. I never considered that staying could require just as much courage as leaving. I set the old sign on the counter. You were not wrong to leave, David. I know. And I was not wrong to stay. I know that now too. Before Christmas, we returned to Heartland Community Bank together to establish the final operating accounts. Thomas Reed reviewed the documents, then looked across the conference table at the 3 of us. Robert would have appreciated this arrangement, he said. David smiled. He probably would have found something wrong with it. Almost certainly, Thomas replied. When the meeting ended, David shook Thomas's hand. Thank you for what you said the first time we came here. Thomas looked at him. I only explained the records. You did more than that. Thomas shook his head. No. Your sister did more than that. I simply refused to let her history disappear because nobody had asked about it. I carried those words with me into the new year. The farm remained leased. The bakery entered its busiest winter season yet. Susan created digital records so organized that even Rachel complimented them. David negotiated a minor improvement to the tenant agreement without once pretending he had saved us from ourselves. Nothing about my outward life changed very much. I still lived in the same modest house. I still drove the same sedan. I still woke before sunrise to bake bread. But when people asked David what his sister did, he stopped calling it a little baking business. He said I owned a successful local bakery and managed the finances of our family farm. I never asked him to say that. I did not need him to. The real change came one cold January morning when we were reviewing the next year's farm budget. David placed the figures in front of me, leaned back, and said, "You have been doing this longer than I have. What am I missing?" I looked at my brother and smiled. For years, my family had believed the quietest life must be the smallest one. Dad had understood something they had missed. A person's worth is not measured by how loudly success announces itself. Sometimes it is measured by the bills quietly paid, the promises kept, the people helped, the work repeated before sunrise, and the things preserved when nobody else even knew they were in danger of being lost.